Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Executive Sessions where we discuss trends, developments, and other topics surrounding the industrial manufacturing sector. I'm your host today, Clayton Gollett, and welcome to the show. It's going to be a great one. Today we're discussing the recent United Auto Workers strike and the latest trends and developments in the auto manufacturing sector. And today we're joined in studio and via Zoom by our guest. To my right, the lovely John Stewart, the co-host, co-founder of MiddleGround Capital. How you doing, bud?
Thanks. I didn't know I was a co-host, so I got the promotion.
Yes. Oh, yes. That check will be in the mail, by the way. Justin, welcome in. Joining via Zoom, he is the head of the New York New York transaction team and a member of the investment committee at MiddleGround Capital. Welcome to the show, bud.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Justin, typically when we have somebody new on the show, we typically have like an interesting fact, but I hear that you've met Prince.
That's true. Yes. Very quickly, I was going to visit a friend when I was very young in Hawaii, wanted to get some Prince tickets. And when we were poking around, we found out where his after party was going to be. And so went there instead and hung out there from like 1 to 4 o'clock in the morning because Prince, I think, sleeps in the day and performed during the night. Wild night.
Yeah, I would say so. Very, very nocturnal if that's the lifestyle.
All these layers of Justin that I just haven't unraveled yet.
I know, right? He's a man who's very interesting indeed. Well, let's dive in. The United Auto Workers strike. Obviously, it's over at this point, but there's still a lot of aftermath, and we'll see how it reshapes the industry with these two experts here today. Justin, let's lead it off with you. The United Auto Workers strike ended some time ago, obviously, but could you give us an overview of what the strike was? What was driving the strike?
It was interesting. I mean, it was a modern strike. It was very different than the strikes before it. And it was very impactful, and I think they were very successful. But I think what a hallmark of this one is that they did it in these cascading stages to like ratchet up pressure, and it was like hyper targeted, and it kept everybody guessing, and it was wild. It was very interesting strike, and I'm glad it has been concluded.
Well, so you mentioned it was different because of the cascading effect. What was the significance of this strike in comparison to previous ones?
You know, it was targeted to, at kind of one plant at a time for each of the Detroit big three, and then they would be given a number of days, and if there wasn't enough progress, round two, and they would pick 3 plants and they wouldn't tell you, and it was cloaked in mystery, and that's very difficult for the OEMs to plan around, and it rewarded some that were making progress. I think one of the weeks they only added another site for 2 of the 3, rewarding one for like making more progress than the others, and they kept the OEMs guessing and nervous. I think is.
I got you, John. I mean, this is, I kind of feel like the more research that we read into it, obviously, you read and you hear that labor conditions, you talk about being able to have a living wage or health benefits and things of that nature. It's things that you've been preaching about every time you've been on the show, and it literally shut down an industry because of it. What do you think that people can do to make changes ahead of time to prevent that? I mean, I know like the obvious is like, just treat people well and do the right thing, but
yeah, look, I mean, it's always a challenge to balance. For the companies, it's a challenge to balance their profitability and the various needs. But we're in a different economy now. It's an economy where we've had a lot of disruption. People have seen rising prices with inflation and prices, and I think generally the climate is that people are more comfortable, I guess would be the term that I would use, paying more for products if they know that the people that are manufacturing the products or they're providing the services are getting paid a wage, which allows them, to have, the basic needs of life. And, with all of the discussion around, the minimum wage and those types of things, anytime that there can be a score for blue collar workers, I'm not going to be opposed to that. There's a balance to it. I think that when you look at industrial manufacturing, probably the auto workers for the OEMs are probably have the richest pay packages, in industrial manufacturing. And so I think there's a lot of people that look at it and maybe think that it's a bit kind of greedy. But, I'm not one of those people. But, I think anytime that there is more going to the people that are actually creating the value, I think that's a good thing, especially when these companies are showing record profits. And the business model is completely changed as well. You notice there's not as much inventory, so in these on the lots, and so those lots in the inventory are really something that there's a lot of risk for the OEMs by having that inventory. And so once that came out of the system with COVID, it's really not been replaced to that same situation. So it creates a different kind of financial situation for these OEMs, and I think they're not going to agree to anything that ultimately they can't afford to do. And so, in the grand scheme of things, minimizing the disruption and the ricochet effects it has across the various industries is always a positive thing. And it seems like the workers got, compensated well.
So, okay, on that note, I know that, your company invests heavily in the manufacturing sector in the automotive industry. Did the strikes affect you all at all?
Yeah, Justin will definitely have more to say about that, but it definitely does it impact us? Sure, it impacted us. I think because it was targeted, it wasn't broad and wide across the all the different OEMs, which is typically how it's done. Usually, when they do this, they'll pick one of the manufacturers and they'll strike kind of broadly. And they got a new president, they have new strategy. It's kind of more of to Justin's point, a modern strike. They were very strategic, went after some of the more profitable, programs, their high demand vehicles, and also protected a lot of their workers, from having disruption to their pay, because you see, a lot of, there's, these people can earn some, wages from the union, but they did it in a very strategic way. And I think it, did it have some disruption? Sure. But could it have been a lot worse? I think yes is the answer to that.
Justin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think we didn't know where they were going to strike or how or for how long, but what we could do for the businesses we own is kind of map out, which of our plants are exposed to which of the Detroit three, what specific platforms. And when we say platform, we mean like we say things like T1XX. What does that mean? That's like the Suburban, the Escalade, like that's a large GM SUV package, for example. And then to just use their names, like the Jeep Wrangler, for example, the Ford Bronco, and the SUVs are the more profitable products. And so, I forget if it was the first or second week that the Ford Bronco was subject to the strike. We had one portfolio company with zero exposure, and another portfolio company had some exposure, but there was some complexity, so it didn't have a very meaningful impact. And then the next week, I think Jeep Wrangler came out, and our two portfolio companies swapped sort of destiny. One of them was exposed, and the other wasn't. And we literally had a list of platforms, and we called it kind of the strike tracker. And each week we would kind of mark in red or green the status. And, the good news for us is there was very little red before it was over.
So, okay, on that note, how do you all prepare when the strike first took place? What was your all's plan of action to kind of weather that storm?
Look, I think that, and we don't really have a overarching plan. Each of the companies will have a plan. And to Justin's point, usually the UAW, they want to have an impact, but they also don't want to have an impact. And so generally that when it happens, they're kind of warning ahead of time, this is what we're going to do. They're giving notice. People are building inventories and all kinds of things so that there's not, damage to the industry long term, because that doesn't benefit them either. Now, to Justin's point, this was a different tactic that they did, and was calculated in order to inflict kind of the maximum amount of pressure without having broad sweeping implications across the different companies. So it was kind of on a case-by-case basis. You don't want to like overreact and spend a bunch of money building up inventory and planning. But, the OEMs kind of lead the charge. And when there's, this type of activity is happening, they'll look at like where they think the impact is going to be. They'll reach out, they'll make requests, for you to build a bank of inventory, for you to do, look at alternative suppliers and all those, different processes. But, it's a case-by-case situation.
So you mentioned earlier that you thought that one of the reasons why this was separate from any other previous strike was the cascading effect, ratcheting pressure up, so on and so forth. Do you think that will be kind of the new norm for strikes going forward?
It was highly successful. I mean, I hope that we don't have another strike for a long time. And then by the next time we have one, there's a new modern. But I think that globally there were lessons learned here. And you know what? The unionization seems to be on the uptick, and strikes seem to be on the uptick, and it's household names like UPS and Starbucks. And I think they all have something to learn from each other, whereas the UAW seemed like quite alone for a long time. They're not alone anymore, and I think they're learning from each other, and it's going to continue to evolve. And how it will evolve, I have no idea.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that like have kept us out of the recession, and that's consumption has continued to be high. I mean, I think we talked about this on one of the last episodes. But people are continuing to buy things, even though prices are increasing. People are continuing to buy things, and they're continuing to spend money, and and then as people continue to buy things, there's a shortage of labor to do some of these lower wage jobs. In all of the industries, we're at record unemployment. And so, you have all of these things. It really changes the dynamic where labor actually has an advantage, over the corporate entity. Like when labor is readily available, so when unemployment is high, and so there's a lot of people looking for work, then the companies have the upper hand because there's a lot of labor and they can attract it. I think, not just, especially in industrial manufacturing where labor is a challenge, and we've spoken on the podcast about it several times, and the way to overcome that, it gives labor like an upper hand. And I think, for companies to recognize that and to be proactive and take proactive approaches is a better solution. You don't ever want to get to the point. I mean, it's kind of like declaring war, on one another. And that's just not good for the relationship. And so I think we're past that, and I think, people should be more proactive at thinking about taking care of the workers and making sure that the people that are manufacturing their products, have the things that they need, and they're looking at wages and they're pushing the pricing to the consumer and seeing what the consumer is willing to absorb. Yes, increasing the profitability of the company is a good thing, but also investing that in the workforce is also something that's a wise move to do. And so, gone are the days where, the corporation can raise the prices, put all the money in their pocket, and forget about the labor because, it's a tight labor market right now. And without the support of the people that actually do the work, they can't, generate the revenues. So, proactive companies, I think, are, thinking about that. They're taking action on that. Hopefully, this is like a warning to others that there's more of this to come as, consumption continues to grow, production output continues to grow, and there continues to be a shortage of labor.
Do you think that the labor markets for the automotive industry were hit harder because of COVID and the supply chain shortages and the chip shortages? Do you think that was able to give them maybe a leg up in comparison to other industrial sectors for striking?
Well, I think it gives them an advantage because, like I said, again, the inventories are low. So
right.
Like, when the auto industry used to have, 90, 120, 180 days of inventory and people are striking, there's really not an impact for, except on like specific product lines. Now there's not a lot of inventory. And I think that's part of the reason the UAW did the targeted approach, because had they like shut down everything system wide, like what happened in COVID,
right,
and without the inventory out there to support it, you can kill demand. And then what happens is, people can't buy new cars. So what do? It makes the used car prices start to go up. That's not a good thing for the automotive industry, because you want to sell people new cars. Like there's new cars being produced all the time. And so you want people to buy new cars. You want them to trade in their old cars and buy new cars. And then as a country, you know, we also like to export our used cars. But when prices go up, then we're not exporting cars, and people are going after buying old cars instead of buying new cars because new cars aren't available. You know, that's something that we saw during COVID, and that's a negative consequence for the industry as overall. So I think a lot of the dynamic around COVID and the reduction of the inventory and the impact on the supply chain and all the disruption and everything, I think it all absolutely played into the strategy that the UAW executed here. And to Justin's point, they executed it well.
So on that note, you know, you're talking about the Detroit Big Three. You know, you're talking about wage gaps and things of that nature. For automakers out there who are struggling to find the capital, how would they go about increasing wages to where, you know, you find the balance? Because obviously, there is a give and take. There has to be understanding on both sides.
But they have the capital, so they have the capital because prices are increasing. So, you know, raw material prices go up, you know, dealership expenses go up, all these different things go up. The price of cars are getting higher and higher and higher and higher. And so, and when there's a contract that's negotiated, and the contract was negotiated at a time when there was a different economic condition, you can see where there could be an imbalance to the workforce. And, you know, and so the OEMs with the UAW, the problem with the contract is there's no incentive for them to proactively address the items in the contract. Whereas in companies where there is no union representation, you know, the smart management teams are looking at that on a regular basis and making those adjustments all the time. I think we're past the point where we need like labor unions to represent workers. I'm not opposed to it, but I think that in this kind of state that we're in now, and as advancement in manufacturing and as a civilization, like we don't need to resort to those tactics. I think business owners need to open their eyes and make investments in their company, also in their workforce, and make sure that they're managing that so that they don't get caught in a similar situation.
Do you think that there's a world where automation and unions can coexist?
Oh, yeah. I mean, most of the automotive factories are probably more highly automated than any other industry. So, the problem is like the UAW, their numbers have been constantly shrinking since the 1970s. Look, there was a lot of power in the hands of the automakers, and a lot of the production, unfortunately, has left North America. So the number of cars being manufactured in North America and that they're not even, most people don't call them the big three anymore. They call them the Detroit three because they used to be the big three because they had the highest sales. Now they don't have the highest sales. Volkswagen, Toyota, those guys have higher sales than the Detroit three. And so they just don't have the same grip on the industry that they used to. They don't manufacture as many cars in North America and in the U.S. as they used to. So they exported a lot of that to lower cost countries, especially a lot of their higher value cars, are made in Mexico. They're made in Canada. They're not made in North America. And so, I think the impact that the UAW can have on their overall operation is diminished. And I think that played into what they were willing to give at this point in time as well. But the management teams in the OEMs are also playing the long game. They may agree to something in the short term that has a lot of consequences, but at some point, if it becomes like too much of a burden for the company, then you risk the trends repeating themselves, where you start to see some of these higher value vehicles that are produced in North America could be easily moved to their production across the borders.
Well, I feel like also you run the risk of automation really coming in fully, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you can't automate, manufacturing a car 100%. There's, you can use it to do some of the more burdensome work, but there's a lot of finesse that's still needed. And so, having humans do some things is just not able to replace that. Not at this time. There's just not technology available to that. I would assure you that in most auto plants, everything that can be automated is already automated. So I don't think it's a catalyst for higher prices for them to try to automate more of the work that's being done, because I think they've already done that. These plants are pretty efficient facilities when you go into them.
Gotcha. Justin, I've got a question for you. Talking about, the strike and everything, there's a big push right now to move towards EVs and trying to develop clean cars, clean energy, things of that nature. Do you think that the strikes have affected any progress on that front?
I think they're not really. So I think the part where EV comes into this is all of these OEMs are kind of increasingly pivoting towards more and more EVs in their fleet and their product portfolio. And there's going to be a burst of CapEx invested to build out capacity for this. In theory, there's going to be a burst of profitability down the road. And, some of what we saw with the strike was the UAW just assuring their participation in that event, in that, profit generation, in that future. So I think that we can talk about EVs for an entire separate podcast. And we're at MiddleGround big believers in it, and they're here to stay. And, despite, one article here or there, it's just all happening faster than we can even anticipate. And so we're big believers in the EV. And I think that the UAW is looking through the windshield at the kind of the future of automotive. And that's very much, centered on EV, but I think they were very different. I think the UAW contract expiration came up, and when the last contract was negotiated, a lot of it was back in the great financial recession, and there were two bankruptcies, right? General Motors was bankrupt, Stellantis, so two of the Detroit three were bankrupt, and their workforces contributed to the turnaround and to the resolution of the bankruptcy, and had some real concessions. And what we saw here is an unwinding of some of that and a revisiting of some of that. And there's also another evolution taking place. The Detroit three, which have been around for a long time, and they're in the industrial Midwest for the most part, but they're moving to the Southwest and the Southeast like everybody else. But they have an older workforce. And, with each passing year, the older workforce is retiring. And, I think COVID probably accelerated some of that when people didn't want to come back to work, or enjoyed fishing and found a different, way to live without having to go back to work. What was really going on here also though, is just a focus on this younger generation who did not necessarily get a great package during the great financial crisis. And had some major gains here in this last round.
Diving in, between 2017 and 2019, the U.S. produced around 17 million cars a year. That number today is more between the range of 15 to 16 million. What's driving that change?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. So first off, we often, for a while, we were calling 2017 to 2019 normal, and how long was it going to take us to get back to normal? But enough time has passed where there's a new normal, and I'll come back to that in a moment. When you obviously we had the COVID shutdown, you had everybody is at home in their pajamas using consumer electronics, and all the semiconductor producers shifted production away from auto to consumer electronics. And then when the automotive production came back on, they found that they couldn't get any semiconductors, and that led to the semiconductor shortage, which really ballooned in 2021, in the early part of 2022. But over 2021, 2022, you also saw just broader supply chain disruption, whether it's a lack of wire harnesses coming out of Ukraine, or cascading shutdowns in Asia, COVID shutdowns. You had liquidity constraints, and I think the most painful of all, you had OEMs with very sporadic demand. The whole industry is set up for scale, and you can be profitable at high volumes, you can be profitable at low volumes, but it's hard to be profitable when you don't know what the volumes are. And that was 2022. An OEM would order 12,000 parts and then say, "Just kidding, we'll take 8." And that was very difficult. And so the reason why volumes today are well below that of 2017, 2019 is we're still coming out of that ditch that was semiconductor shortage and then broader supply chain issues. And so the system was just not healthy enough to produce the level of production that we saw in 2017, 2019. However, there's also a bit of a new normal in that in 2017, 2019, there was a much larger kind of low-cost sedan element to that volume, and that category has really compressed. In some cases, gone away. The OEMs aren't focusing on it. Certainly, they make more profits with SUVs and larger vehicles, but a lot of people who might buy an entry-level sedan are instead taking public transit or ride sharing, Ubers. The kind of the broader changes around mobility seems to have really taken a hold at that lower cost level first. And so I say the new normal is not going to be 2019. It may be a lower level of production, but the mix is certainly going to be different. It's going to favor more profitable SUVs, crossover vehicles, electric vehicles, and far less of the entry-level, low-cost sedans, light cars that were around back then.
Well, I would. Okay, John, I've got a follow up for you. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, electric vehicle penetration in the U.S. is expected to increase 30% by 2030, from about currently 5%. What's driving that shift?
Everything, regulation. There's countries and states that have said that you can't purchase internal combustion engines after certain dates. I don't think that there's any way that we'll get to 30% by 2030. I think that's like fantasy. What you're seeing right now, Mercedes just announced that they're taking their electric vehicle out of the U.S. And they're not even selling it here anymore.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's an interesting dynamic that's gone on. So before everybody got into electric cars, Tesla was the only one that was making electric cars. And Tesla still has not been able to tackle the volume problem. They can't make enough cars. And so what there was a lot of pent-up demand for people that wanted an electric car, right? And then once everybody had an electric car that wanted an electric car, the other people that don't want an electric car, they don't want an electric car. So they're not going to buy an electric car. And so they're going to buy an internal combustion. That's what they're going to do. So now you're seeing that actually there's a lot of incentives to try to sell the electric cars. People aren't just going after them. The infrastructure isn't built up and isn't capable of handling 30% electric cars. There's not enough progress being made to expand the infrastructure to handle 30% electric cars. These are, instead of like our, politicians in Washington, like fighting over, like trivial things, there's real problems that need to be addressed. There is an opportunity to make a dramatic change, with vehicles. And even though, an electric vehicle really isn't, better for the environment than an internal combustion engine, because the energy to produce needed to produce the electricity to power the electric car is, has its own problems. And then the rare earth metals that are used in the batteries present their own problems. And so the whole way that we're going about the electric vehicle system I think is ludicrous. The idea of every car having its own battery and driving around with its own battery is probably the most inefficient way to make an electric car. And so, there's been no leadership on electric vehicles. And that's the real shame there's real issues that could be being addressed. There's real solutions for some of the issues that we're trying to tackle on a global scale. And there's no leadership on addressing these issues. And so it's kind of like the Wild West. There's not even standards for, some of the connected vehicles and some of those things, which have inhibited a lot of the progress. So there's no way I'll take the under on 30% electric cars by 2030. Anybody wants to take that bet, I'm in for whatever amount that you want to go in. There's no way that we're at 30% electric vehicles by 2030.
So how do you inspire the average consumer to go towards something that's more electric?
Well, at the end of the day, they have to make the choice, and we're a country of choice. We're not a country of regulation. And so the consumer has to make a choice. And I have an electric car. I've got a bunch of internal combustion engine cars as well. And I think it's cool to have an electric car. I think it's good. but it's not really impacting, like having electric cars isn't making the climate better. It's not reducing carbon emissions. It's not doing the things that, you would think it would be. It's more of a technological shift than anything. Now you got to get some momentum before you can actually, have the infrastructure to like create the impact. I understand that. But there's no like uniform like standards, being adopted, for these cars. When you look at like internal combustion engine, there's already a lot of standards, the types of fuel that people use, and everybody's developing their own battery technology. Everybody's treating it like it's intellectual property. And so everybody going to doing their own thing. All the automakers are trying to buy mines, and they're trying to get their hands on rare earth metals. And so it's creating, it's just a very inefficient way to like handle and tackle the whole problem. It's just not as efficient as like what it could be if there was like leadership on the issue.
So what do you think is needed in order to, more regulations, more rules, more?
Look at the leadership. It's leadership. The government doesn't need to enact, regulation and tell people you have to buy an electric car. If they told everybody you had to buy electric cars, that sounds like a big, bold politician move, but there's no infrastructure. So if you want everybody to buy an electric car, or if you even want people to use their current electric car more, you need more infrastructure. There's no fast charging, in Lexington. If you want a fast charger, you got to go to Georgetown. Like, really? Georgetown's a smaller town than Lexington. So, you don't have access to fast chargers. There's no infrastructure. There's no investment. There's no incentive. There's no standard protocol. There's not a standard charger. Like, you go to a gas pump at a gas station, it operates pretty much the same way that you go to anyone. You go to some of these chargers and they operate differently. Half the time you go to them, the fast charger's not even working. So you bought this car that has the ability to be fast charged. You can charge in 20 minutes, get 80% battery, but it doesn't work. And so, there's a huge problem with the infrastructure, and there's just no leadership. There needs to be leadership in order to solve the problem. And, given to their own devices, like the OEMs, the battery manufacturers, the people building the charging stations, the gas stations, which should be leading the charge on electric, charging stations and doing that. There's just nobody's coming together and trying to develop a plan to solve the problem. And so that's what's missing. It's leadership.
And I'll just add one layer to that, which is you're going to see kind of uneven progression. So some parts of the country are going to have faster penetration than others. I'll give you an example. Like right now, there's just as many chargers in the United States as there are gas stations, but the lion's share of them are in people's garages. And I live in New York City. I have a shared garage. We don't have a charger. To find a public charger, I think there's 3 of them at a Whole Foods in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is the size of Chicago. I'm in trouble. So I have challenges about electrification adoption. But I have friends and people I know who live in the suburbs, and they have a charger in their garage, and they zip around the neighborhood. They go back home, and it's charging while they're sleeping. And if they have a second home, they drive it to the second home. They've got a charger there too. So there are certain applications, there are certain contexts where adoption is easier, and there are certain contexts where it's quite difficult. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and John alludes to it, I would hate, to leave New York City and go out to the country with not knowing exactly where I'm going to charge in an electric vehicle. That's pretty scary. So I think there's going to be some natural issues that need to be overcome over time.
Okay, well, so you had mentioned earlier that you said that the EV industry was here to stay and it's not going anywhere. But with a lack of infrastructure and a lack of leadership, I don't want to buy one. I mean, why would I go out and buy one? A perfect example, we rented a car whenever I was in Florida, gasoline versus electric. I stopped half a mile and filled up the car, and then I had a buddy that I was down there with and had an electric car and drove for 45 minutes to find one that actually had an adapter that worked. Mm-hmm. And it couldn't get the full charge, so it got charged.
you were in Florida. You were
Oh,
in unfamiliar territory. You weren't in the comforts of your home, choosing to go to the store and back. And so again, that's like another context where personal travel, vacation travel. Why opt for an electric car? You'll always opt for something that takes some uncertainty out of the equation. So I think the electric car is only going to work when the surrounding circumstances have kind of more predictability and dependability and reliability.
I guess the biggest question that I have for you guys is, because of these issues now, do you think that this could potentially stunt the growth or potentially halt EV within the next 20
It already
years?
has. It already has stunted the growth. As like I told you, the people that want electric cars, they can get them now.
Yeah.
Like, let's be realistic. Everybody doesn't want an electric car. They just don't. And
Right.
there's real issues, like there's range anxiety. To Justin's point, I got one. I got a charger. We have a charger here at the office. You can come in, you can charge your car, you can go home, and it's fine for that. If I'm going to take a road trip and I'm going to drive, America's a big country.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
you go to Europe and you can go from one major city to the next in 2 hours, right? And
Right.
so it's a different situation. Here we've got a lot of real estate that goes between, major cities. And sometimes you can drive for 4 or 5 hours in an internal combustion engine. You can't drive for 4 or 5 hours in any of the electric cars. Like, there's
Right.
just not enough range. And so, where are you going to charge it? And then, there might be a charging station, and maybe your car says, oh, there's a charging station, you can go here. And then when you go, 50% of the charging stations don't work.
Yeah.
And then the other two have people already on them, and you got to wait for them to charge their car before you can charge your car. And so even with the limited amount of vehicles on the road that are electric now, if you go to the fast charging station in Georgetown, if you go to the, Meyer that has Tesla charging stations, they're all full. Like, when you go, they're all full. How are you going to get to 30%? Like, someone's got to build more charging stations. Who's responsible for that? Is it the gas station people? Is it the government? Is it the car companies? Is it the car rental companies? Like, who's going to take the lead and who's going to be responsible for it? Nobody's decided that yet.
Do you think that that's a possible area for somebody to kind of swoop in,
Yeah, here's the problem. Here's the problem again. So when you buy an electric car, most of them you get like a free membership to the charging, and you can go charge for free. Okay, well, if you can go charge for free, and people are, the OEMs are backing most of these, like fast charging. The rapid charge station in Georgetown is, a station that was put in by Volkswagen, Audi, and they don't charge for their members. But if you're not one of their members, you got to pay. So most people can charge their car for free, on these free chargers. Well, who's gonna like put something in you can't get paid for?
Yeah,
So it's just like and then what do you charge for it, right? And so it's just a big problem. And then you've got peak electricity demand. So that's another problem. So if you got a business, a lot of people don't understand this, but when you own a business, like when you own a factory, you don't pay the electric bill based on the hours that are used. You pay based on what's called the peak rate. So the peak amount of electricity that your plant pulls, usually it's like at a startup of the operation, the peak amount of electricity that you pull, that's what rate that you have to pay, because the electric company has to reserve the capacity on the grid for you to be able to use that all the time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right? So you're paid at the peak rate. Well, you think about these charging stations, right? And so you get, everybody goes out at rush hour, and and then people are stopping to charge, and then you've got like this peak usage, right? So it puts a big toll on the grid. Our grid can't even handle the houses. Like, there's blackouts. There's a big blackout problem. The one thing that our government can agree on is that our power grid hardening isn't what it needs to be. It's been rated like a D-, and we're operating off of an executive order off of every presidency for the last 4 presidents to, repair the grid. And so the grid can't even handle the houses right now. How's it going to handle all the cars? Right?
Yeah.
So you got to address the problem. You got to think it through. You can't, we all have electric cars, but there's no grid power. There's no, there's no regulation around what rates get charged for charging stations. There's a lot of things here that there's just a lack of leadership on. And the federal government is the lights are on, but nobody's home. And so that's and it's not just this issue, it's a lot of issues. And, I don't really get political that much, but again, it's a lack of leadership. So the thing that's inhibiting all of these things from happening is a lack of leadership.
Justin, final thoughts?
Try out an electric car.
All right. Well, you've heard it here. Thank you both for joining us today on another episode of Executive Sections. Make sure, to anybody out there who's listening, subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. A big thanks to John Stewart and Justin Steil. Steil. I just want to call you the man of steel every time.
Style.
I know he's got the style. It's Justin Steil.
It doesn't get better, people. It just doesn't get better. The more you listen to Clayton, it just doesn't get any better.
It doesn't. They asked me to be a witness on the stand. They're like, no, never mind. It's fine. We'll lose. Thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. And also just want to give a huge shout out to Noah Day, Clark, and Andy behind the scenes. They make all this come to life. But that'll do it here for us today. Join us next time when we discuss more trends, developments, and other exciting news surrounding the industrial manufacturing world. Until then, we'll see you then.